name is Emily Marks, and I'm the Chief U.S. District Judge for the Middle District of Alabama. It is my distinct honor on behalf of the court to welcome you all here today. The historic significance of the events that took place in this very courtroom is breathtaking, as is the significance of the collective accomplishments of those gathered here today. Your presence in this venue honors the history of this court, and we thank you for that. Now, if you would please stand and join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now I would like to introduce to you the mayor of the great city of Montgomery, Mayor Stephen Reed.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for being here in Montgomery. Thank you for being in this place, in these hallowed grounds. On this day, we are assembled here because people chose destiny over division. We are not here to commemorate a week, but to be fortified by the work. What are we doing to collectively blaze our own trail? Therefore, because of the hearts of many and the actions of others, I stand here in a position as the first African-American mayor of the city of Montgomery in its 200-year history. I'm in this position because many of those who marched, like Congressman John Lewis, who not only endorsed me for mayor, called to talk to me about why he was endorsing me for mayor and what I was to do if I were to become mayor. And then did a radio ad so that I could be the mayor. I stand here because of his sacrifice and the sacrifice of many others. Now, we are not removed from the complicated past that is Montgomery, that is Alabama, that is this nation. We should be grateful for the teachable moments in the history of this city that's brought us all together here today. It was those unknown fighters who sacrificed to integrate schools, lunch counters, and march toward freedom. People like Bernard Lafayette, Robert Moses, we see you. Everyone didn't get the snapshot moment, but marched on to uphold the potential of this nation's freedom, justice, and pursuit of happiness. They saw Montgomery and this country as bigger than the sum of our own ambitions. The person who understands life, who understands the frailty of it all, never lifts himself above the people. Whether it's the faith of what governments can do, it's the faith and determination of people that ultimately decide these outcomes. Loyalty, faith, and perseverance are the pillars that have built this community. In 1971, Ebony magazine sent the poet Gwendolyn Brooks and the photographer Moneta Sleet here to chronicle the story of the city of Montgomery. After the boycott and the marches and the progress that put this city in the American lexicon, they made a pilgrimage here to record what we had built on that history, what had happened 6 years after the march. Their conclusion was that in many ways, Montgomery had become America's hometown. And while we desired and saw Montgomery as being something greater, as other new South capitals arose, challenges still remained. I leaned into history and heard the words of the late E.D. Nixon, who said Montgomery was a pilot light for the nation. We desire for this city to be the pilot light for the nation, now that shines as a beacon for those who live here, for those who visit here, and for those who may seek a new beginning. And with that history, our pilot light moment has led us like a beacon through the night. After our nighttime dreams, we shall wake up to the fruits of our work, the fulfillment of our promises that we desire on the streets of Montgomery, Selma, Birmingham, and other cities throughout the Black Belt region of Alabama. But we also seek to see the fulfillment of promises inside our schools and with our business colleagues and throughout the halls of government. We've been the pilot light of so much around the South and throughout America that this entire nation is better for it. We are all better for it. Access to the halls of government, not to make history, but to make a difference. Not about position, but about the power of change. Where leaders like Speaker Nancy Pelosi from Maryland, the daughter of a mayor, to California representation, an example to young women and young men who, like Queen Esther, a woman of great courage, with prayer, power, and bravery, stood up and saved the people. Her name will not be mentioned in the footnotes where it is merely mentioned, but rather it will be listed in the table of contents where it will be highlighted. Access to public spaces, the right to vote so that all the voices are heard, thanks to Judge Frank Johnson, who learned about the ideals of a more perfect union, who made decisions even in the face of obstruction and challenge. He exhibited courage. Don't be mistaken by those titles. There is something much greater above all of those. Edwin Markham once said, "Why build these cities glorious if man unbuilded goes? In vain we build the world unless the builder grows." We must strive towards unity, but we must also strive towards parity. So in this shining moment, at the intersection of history and possibility, we are prepared to do the people's business in Montgomery. Now is the time to move into a future with the attitude and energy to do the work that progress requires. It cannot be enough to commemorate the courage of hundreds of people who started at Brown Chapel AME Church who would not be turned around, who wouldn't settle for the obstruction. Fed up with suffering the constant indignities led by a young student leader in a trench coat, Army surplus backpack, who stood chest out and eyes forward, who crossed the river into a wilderness to lead the people to a land that's promised. But I, or shall I say we, need your help. Political, philanthropic, and corporate. Selma doesn't need your tears. Lowndes County doesn't need your well wishes. Montgomery doesn't need your good thoughts. We need your action. We need your talents. We need your influence to help change outcomes for so many still left behind, even though their faith and politics help change our outcomes. So as you leave today to go to Birmingham, and tomorrow to Selma, then back to your respective positions, please think about how you can help make this a part of America's history. Think about what your role will be in changing the narrative, in changing outcomes. Think about what your courage can do, not just where you sit, but for where it originated, here in Alabama. Thank you, and welcome to Montgomery, and I pray I see you again.
And now I would like to introduce to you Judge Myron Thompson, a senior district judge here in the Middle District. And Judge Thompson has been on the bench for almost 40 years.
I'm used to that. I hope you can hear me. I really want to welcome you, members of the Faith and Politics Institute. It is a true pleasure to have you here. And we judges who are here, all of us just about, are here to welcome you. That says a lot about this court, and it says a lot about you. Also, I'd like to just recognize the Johnson Institute, which basically was created to honor Judge Johnson. And the members, I think the board members are over there. Would you just stand for a second? Now, I know that many of you just came from the memorial, a long overdue remembrance of the grave injustices that occurred literally throughout this country. And I know that many of you just came from the Legacy Museum, which poses a direct and deep challenge to our criminal justice system. But they are new buildings, and you went to see what was in them. This is an old building. You've come here not only to see what is in this building, but also because of what occurred here, what happened here. You can look up and you see this incredible ceiling, the stately balcony, the woodwork, the majesty of this place. It is awe-inspiring, it is beautiful. But we call this America's courtroom, and that's what we now call it, not because of its majesty and beauty, but because of what happened here. I know that many of you already know the history of Jim Crow in this state, the sordid history of separate but grossly, inhumanly unequalness in the treatment of the African Americans who lived here. That is in this state, in this region of the country, indeed, in this throughout this country. I lived and grew up under Jim Crow, as did many of you here, seated here as members of your delegation, you luminaries. We all know what Jim Crow was like, where from literally the cradle to the grave, things were separate and so unequal. I know we have some young people here, I think from Washington State and California. I think of Jalen, and by the way, that's the name of my son, Ayana, Jada, Ursa, Ella, or Ellie, Faith, and Jennifer. And I just want to tell you all that I drank out of a colored water fountain and the water was not colored. But the fact that I did, I think, is important in my own upbringing as to what I understood about justice and law and about injustice as well. When I was growing up, there was one place in this entire state where one could be treated based on your character and not based on your color. I call this place, this courtroom, an oasis of justice in a desert of injustice. And you are now sitting in that oasis. And one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that desert of injustice has changed is because of the person who sat behind this bench. Frank Johnson. As many of you, I think, already know, he entered many decisions that changed the character of this state and, in fact, this nation. And I'm just going to go over a few of the cases. I know you're pressed for time, but I think these cases, we need to be reminded of these cases. The first one is White versus Cook, which overruled the systematic exclusion of blacks from juries. But, by the way, it also overruled a law in Alabama that excluded women from juries. You know, blacks could serve on juries before women could. That comes as a shock, I think, to a lot of women. Many of these injustices that were corrected for blacks also resulted in the correction of the injustices for others, and in particular for women. Frazier, another case that basically resulted in the desegregation of employment in the state of Alabama, where people were promoted, demoted, hired without regard to race. NAACP versus Allen, later known as Paradise, which resulted in the desegregation of the Alabama state troopers. Lee versus Macon, which resulted in the desegregation of the entire system of statewide education. Browder versus Gale, which resulted in the desegregation of public transportation in the wake of Rosa Parks' valiant, heroic sit-down. Williams versus Wallace, which resulted in the Selma to Montgomery March. It was here, from this bench, that the decision was entered that allowed the Selma to Montgomery March to go forward. These are just some of the cases. There are many more. And what's remarkable about these cases is not simply that Judge Johnson found in favor of the plaintiffs, it's also remarkable in the way he crafted remedies. When I was in law school, there were classes taught on remedies, and quite often a significant portion of those classes would be devoted to how Frank Johnson remedied problems. He was sometimes known as the remedies judge. And you don't find that in the law. You find that in the character and person, the fairness of the person who's crafting that remedy. I'll give you an example. When he would enter a decision, say, outlawing certain voting restrictions, the decision would go down, and eventually, in fact, quite quickly, those responsible for carrying out the state laws would find other obstacles, other ways to deny blacks the right to vote. The crafty Judge Johnson realized that the way to solve that problem was the status quo. That is, when he entered a decision and set aside a procedure, he froze the system so that no other obstacle could be created to prevent blacks from voting. Does that sound familiar? That's Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, right here. The same is true with regard to Frazier, the no bypass rule. That is, before the state of Alabama could skip over a black to promote a white, it simply had to give a reason. It's not asking very much, but it resulted essentially in the desegregation of employment in the state of Alabama for state employees. Just simple, thoughtful, carefully crafted rules like that changed how this state operated. I was the first African-American assistant attorney general, probably because of that rule. We are all beneficiaries of Frank Johnson. We all stand on his shoulders. And as his, I don't say I replaced him, I say I followed him. I know what it is like to sit behind this bench and sit in this chair and take on that awesome responsibility of dealing out fairness. But to deal it out in the 60s and 70s, when people were, as they did for Frank Johnson, bombing his mother's house, threatening his life, he was a truly remarkable man. And so when you sit in this courtroom and you look at the beautiful ceiling and you look at the balcony and you think of all of its majesty, the majesty was really in the person who sat here. We sat on many cases, you know, and he would always say in writing an opinion, let's put it down where the goats can get it. I don't know if many of you have heard that phrase. I had never heard it before. I went and looked it up on the internet. It basically means putting it down so that everyday people could get it. I sometimes think he really meant it for Alabama politicians. But anyway, he said, oh, let's put it down where the goats can get it. And I tried to use it in an opinion once, and one of my law clerks says, Judge, you've got to take that out because the readers might think you're calling them goats. But I can hear him now sort of saying to me, wind this up and put it down where the goats can get it. And if I were to put it down where the goats could get it, I think I would say that he truly gave meaning to the Constitution. He made the Constitution walk the walk. Thank you. Congressman Lewis, we have something special for you. You may stay where you are, however, and it's over here. There, but I wanted to say, and Judge Albrecht, you'll help me. Yes. You'll just, someone could just hold it there for us so we can see it. 9 years ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the events at the bus station, the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders were so badly beaten. And we invited the Freedom Riders to come back to this courtroom, and indeed to my chambers, to meet with, you won't believe this, the governor of Alabama at the time the events occurred, Governor Patterson. Congressman Lewis and Governor Patterson sat down with each other and broke bread. See it here, and I hope you'll have a chance to come look at this, and we'll send it to you. But this is a picture of Governor Patterson and Congressman Lewis. Now, Judge Albritton? Yeah. Here you are. Judge Albritton was responsible for getting the governor. Why don't you tell us that?
Well, Governor Patterson was elected governor on a very strong segregationist platform. In later years, he moved with the times. When we built the new courthouse over here, there was talk about the possibility of tearing down the bus station to make room for some of the new courthouse building. Judge Thompson had a public hearing for people to come in and comment about that, and Governor Patterson was one of the ones who came and urged that it be kept in place because it was a part of history. Later, when this came up with the 50th anniversary, I got in touch with Governor Patterson to see about the possibility of the two of them getting together with the Freedom Riders, and he jumped at the invitation. He was delighted to come. We sat right behind where we are now for a meal with Congressman Lewis at the head of the table and Governor Patterson sitting next. Governor Patterson said in effect that they were all heroes and that he didn't think he would have had the courage to do what they did when they came here and changed history. Also in 2011, Governor Patterson nominated Congressman Lewis to be inducted into the Alabama Academy of Honor, and in 2011 he was inducted as a member of the Alabama Academy of Honor. It was a great occasion then, it's a great occasion now. Congressman Lewis, we're so delighted that you were able to be with us today.
Not quite finished yet. I'd like to read to you the inscription at the bottom. I'm not sure whether it's called a montage or a plaque or what. I looked that up on the internet. Wasn't quite sure what the correct name is. But this is the quote at the end, and it's by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform oppressors into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. I think he was talking about Congressman Lewis.
And now I am very pleased to introduce from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, our senior judge, Joel Dubina.
This is the only time you'll ever see Martha sitting lower than I am. Before I say a few words about my relationship with my late colleague, mentor, and friend, Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr., I too want to recognize Congressman John Lewis. Many of you in the audience don't know this, but Congressman Lewis was instrumental in sponsoring the legislation to get a bill through Congress concerning a building that is adjacent to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. And that building, thanks to Congressman Lewis, was named the John C. Godbout Federal Building. You'll recall, Congressman, we had a dedication ceremony in Atlanta on August the 16th, 2010, and you were kind and gracious enough to not only attend that day, but to speak. I had a chance to publicly thank Congressman Lewis for introducing this legislation and really pulling the laboring oar and getting it through Congress that day. But today, I thank you in the state of Alabama for what you did. And lastly, and maybe even more important than that, I want to thank you for all the courtesies you've shown my daughter Martha over the past 9.5 years. We need more people like you who understand what civility and collegiality means, and somehow in this country, we've got to get those things back. I was 8 years old when President Eisenhower appointed Judge Frank Johnson to the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. As a child growing up in segregated Montgomery, I had heard and read much about Judge Johnson, but it was not until 1973 in this courthouse when a very fine lawyer, Joe Espy, and I were clerking for Judge Robert Varner, the other federal district judge in this courthouse. A good friend of mine, David Bagwell, was clerking at the same time for Judge Johnson, and David and I grew up together. We were camp counselors together, and occasionally I would go to Judge Johnson's chambers and pick David's brain about difficult legal questions. It was during one of those visits that David first introduced me to Judge Johnson. From the moment I first met the judge, he was larger than life. His steely eyes bored into you behind reading glasses that were perched precariously on his nose. It was so unnerving, and it was enough to make anyone with any sense tremble. Although in later years I discovered he had a warm side to him, as a young lawyer, I will tell all of you, he scared me to death. The judge was so important to the rule of law and to justice and equality during the tumultuous 1950s and 1960s that there have been 5 books written about his life. I tried many cases in this courtroom in front of Judge Johnson as a young lawyer. In fact, 3 months after I finished my clerkship, he appointed me to represent a Pakistani bank robber in this courtroom, and we had to use an interpreter This was my first jury trial at the ripe old age of about 23. Over the years, I tried many other cases in front of him. He would frequently appoint young lawyers like Judge Thompson and me to represent defendants in criminal cases or prisoners who challenged conditions of confinement under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. I enjoyed trying those cases, and the judge really got to know me better as a lawyer. I did participate in two really big landmark cases he decided. The first was a case called Lynch versus Baxley. In that case, there was a constitutional challenge to the commitment statutes in the state of Alabama. And at the time, the mental institutions across our state were full of thousands of people. Bryce Hospital, the largest mental institution in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, had 5,000 patients in it. Judge Johnson wrote the majority opinion for a three-judge federal court, and he ordered that recommitment hearings be held for every single patient in every mental institution in the state of Alabama. He appointed me, and Judge Thompson was appointed as well as guardian ad litem to represent many of the patients. Upon completion of all of those recommitment hearings, the population of Bryce Hospital alone dropped from 5,000 to 1,200 patients. That means 3,800 people had been confined in mental institutions who should have never been there to begin with. It was deeply tragic and saddening to see what happened in that case, although the end result was a good one. In 1978, an amazing event happened in Alabama politics. The three most popular politicians for governor, Baxley, Beasley, and Brewer, all of whom had great name recognition, ran for governor. And an unknown from Auburn, Alabama named Fob James came out of nowhere and won the election. Shortly after that, Governor James and Attorney General Braddock appointed me, along with one of my law partners, to represent the governor in the ongoing case of White versus Stickney, which is truly the landmark mental health case in this nation. What Judge Johnson did was in 1971, he held that every single person who's involuntarily committed in a mental institution has a federal constitutional right to treatment. It was a landmark decision where a judge ruled for the first time that the federal Constitution was implicated in that kind of case. The case was tried in 1971, and Judge Johnson set out 34 minimal constitutional standards that the state of Alabama had to meet. He established a Human Rights Committee to monitor the case. The first thing he asked me to do was, the governor, was to travel all over the state and visit every mental institution and come back and give him a report, which I did. I met in the governor's office with the governor, Lieutenant Governor McMillan, Attorney General Braddock, David Bronner, Governor James' first finance director, Speaker of the House, Joe McCorkadale, and the governor said, "Joel, tell us about it." I said, "It's worse than the plaintiffs say it is." And then I went so far as to say, none of you would put anyone you love in any of the institutions that I visited. As a result of that, the state confessed error. I told the governor it was the only thing we could do. We were not in compliance with the 34 minimal constitutional standards. We came up here for a hearing, and Judge Johnson looked down at me and said, "Are you in compliance or not?" I said, "No, sir, we're not." He said, "What do you think I should do?" He had recently put the state penitentiary system into receivership, and I asked him to do the same thing with the mental health system. Judge Johnson believed federal judges should not run state institutions as long as state officials are attempting to do the right thing. And he wanted to give Governor James an opportunity to do the right thing. In 1980, Judge Thompson came on the bench and inherited that monstrous case. In 1983, I went on the federal bench, so I was no longer involved in it, and I understand it went on for years after that in Judge Thompson's courtroom. I want to change a little bit now and talk about my social relationship with the judge. Some stories I can tell you and some I cannot, because some of the stories might chill the dignity of these proceedings today. In 1983, Judge Johnson invited me on his first fishing trip. He loved to fish for speckled trout, and he fished in Florida and Louisiana. And I saw Peter Canfield here earlier. Peter was on the very first fishing trip that I went on. It was Peter who clerked for Judge Johnson, Pat Sims, a very fine lawyer in Mobile, who clerked for Judge Johnson, Curtis Caver, the former clerk of the United States District Court here, Judge Johnson, and me. And Judge Johnson and I took his boat from Lake Martin down to Horseshoe, which is on the west coast of Florida, and we fished. After that trip, we went many times to the Chandelier Islands, which is a chain of islands off the coast of Louisiana. Then we went down to Cutoff, and as far down in Louisiana as Golden Meadow, which is at the very end of the state. I have so many memories and so many stories I could tell you, but I will share two. At some point, Judge Johnson invited our colleagues, Judge Choflat from Florida and Judge Arlen Neer Anderson from Georgia, to go on these trips with us. When we fished the Chandelier Islands, we would leave on a large boat from Bayou Labatry, Alabama, ride all night until we got to the islands, and then we would fish 2 men to a skiff and go out early in the morning, usually come in for lunch, and then go back out in the afternoon. On this particular day, Judge Choflat and Judge Johnson were fishing together. I was fishing with Judge Anderson. Well, we had agreed we'd all come back at noon and meet at the large boat, and when Judge Johnson and Judge Choflat didn't show up, we all became very concerned. Now, I have to stop and tell you all this. We had a ritual every day right before noon where we saluted the Constitution. And I don't mean like this. It was with a miniature of Scotch or a miniature of Jack Daniels. I got concerned because I thought maybe they over-saluted the Constitution that day. But anyway, we finally saw them come in the horizon, and what had happened was the tide was low when we left that morning, so much of the islands was exposed, but when they decided to go back to the main boat, the tide had risen and there were no landmarks out there. Not only that, they came up on a drug boat with armed men aboard and then almost ran out of gasoline before they made it back to the main boat. Fortunately, they made it back safely, but I never let Judge Johnson forget that. The second story involves a trip to Swanee, Florida. Ruth Johnson, who I'll say a word about in just a minute, was a stickler about cleanliness. She'd go berserk with this coronavirus going on right now. But everywhere the judge went on these fishing trips, we stayed in these fish camps. Now, keep in mind, most I ever paid for a room was $7 a night. But they were clean, but Ruth would always send Judge with a couple of cans of Lysol. Well, Judge Choflat and I were rooming together at Bill's Fish Camp down at Swanee, and Judge Johnson and Curtis Caver were rooming next to us, and the judge came into our room with a can of Lysol and said, "I'd like to disinfect and clean your room," and I politely declined. I mean, he was going to spray the bed, the pillow, the headboard, everything. Well, about an hour later, Judge Choflat and I go over to Judge Johnson's room to have a drink before we walked across the street and had dinner. I walked in there, Judge Johnson had sprayed these maple headboards with Lysol. It ate the finish off the maple headboard. And I looked at him and I said, Judge, you know those things cost about $600 a piece, and you have destroyed them. It's the only time I ever saw him where he was totally speechless. Let me tell you the end of the story, though, and I learned something here. Somebody went and got a can of Ajax, and if you rub it on the maple headboards, the finish comes back. Judge Johnson was not only warm and gracious to my wife Beth and me, but he loved our children. He was particularly fond of our son Mitchell, and before he died, he left his two bronze bookends of Abraham Lincoln to our son. He was also fond of making furniture, and we have a wonderful card table in our room, in our house, that was made by him. And I just can tell you, he made some beautiful furniture and grandfather clocks. He was a very talented man in addition to being a great judge. On December 6, 1989, tragedy struck the 11th Circuit when Judge Robert Vance was blown up with a pipe bomb in Birmingham, Alabama. He was killed instantly, and his wife was in serious condition. Judge Johnson called me on a Saturday afternoon to let me know the news, and it's the only time I think I ever saw the most courageous man I've ever known really afraid. I asked him if he had a weapon in his house. He said, a shotgun. I said, load it, lock the door, don't let anybody in. I said, I'm calling the FBI, which I did right away. Immediately, FBI agents and U.S. Marshals went to judges' houses all over the circuit in Georgia, Florida, and Alabama because they didn't know what we were dealing with. About 2 months after that, Judge Johnson summoned me to his chambers, and he said, Joel, how would you like to be on the 11th Circuit? And I said, what? And he said, there's some judges on the court, including me, that would like to see you on the court. That was the highest compliment I have ever been paid my entire life. That he thought I was worthy to sit on a court with him. In his usual fashion, it was 4 o'clock Friday afternoon when he told me this, and he gave me until Monday morning at 8 o'clock to let him know if he could float my name in Washington. And so my wife and I talked about it that weekend. I called every judge on the 11th Circuit who had been a trial judge first, and I said, knowing what you know about both jobs, do you have any regrets taking an appointment to the 11th Circuit? And they said, no, Joel, let the judge, let him float your name, and let's see what happens. Well, the rest is history. Judge Johnson obviously had powerful contacts in Washington with both Democrats and Republicans, because it was George H.W. Bush who actually put me on the 11th Circuit, but it never would have happened without Judge Johnson's support. After I went on the court, Judge Johnson and I traveled to Atlanta many, many times. The first year on the court, I had marshals with me for 13 months. All of us had U.S. Marshal protection. But all of our cases were heard in Atlanta, even though we sit in Miami, Jacksonville, Florida, and here in Montgomery for security reasons until they caught the individual who assassinated Judge Vance. I got really close to the judge on the fishing trips, but I got even closer to him as his colleague on the court because I saw that he, every single day, practiced the 3 things that I think make a great judge. First is integrity. He was a man of integrity. Second, he was a man of courage, by some of the cases that Judge Thompson talked about. He was a tremendous man of courage. And third, he was fair. He was fair in every case. He was the best trial judge I ever appeared in front of. And it didn't matter if you practiced law 3 months or 40 years. He treated all lawyers the same. And all of those of us who were judges need to remember that, especially you younger judges. Treat everyone the same. After his health began to decline and he became bedridden, Beth and I would go by every Sunday and visit with the judge and Ruth Johnson. And I want to tell all of you, Judge Johnson could not have done in his life what he did without the support of his wife, Ruth Johnson. She was a tough lady. Both of them were from Winston County, the free state of Winston, which seceded from the Confederacy during the Civil War. And I think his background of growing up in that county had a lot to do with his life and his judicial philosophy and the way he lived every single day. July 23rd, 1999, Curtis Caver called me and said, Judge Johnson is gravely ill. I do not think he will live throughout the day, but he's conscious. If you want to go by and see him, this will be the last time you ever see him. So I immediately left and I went to the Johnson house. Ruth was in the den and she said, Joel, go back and see Frank. He's back in the bedroom. So Curtis and I went back there. He had his eyes open, but he had pneumonia. He was having great difficulty breathing. I held his hand. I told him how much I cared about him. I told him how much he had meant to me in my lifetime and what an honor it was to know him, not just as a judge, but as a human being. He died 20 minutes after I left their house, so I'm glad I got to see him one last time. After his death, he was buried in Haleyville, his hometown. Beth and I continued to visit Ruth Johnson every Sunday after our own church service. She was a marvelous lady. She loved my wife like the daughter that she always wanted but never had. She was just an outstanding person, just like the judge. The last Sunday we went to see her, the two women who stayed with her were out in the driveway in tears. She had just died before we got there. But what a marvelous couple they both were together. They both were like steel molded together. I miss them both a lot. The judge taught me many valuable lessons in life, like the best place to cast a line for a speckled trout, but most importantly, he taught me what it means to be a good lawyer and a good judge and to adhere to your ethics and principles no matter the circumstances or the consequences. Because I knew him not only as a judge, but as a mentor, I most remember his courage in the face of adversity and his strong and independent will. He justly became known as the central defender of civil rights in America. For his courage and reasoned decisions, this courthouse that you are in today was named in his honor. And it was named in his honor while he was still alive. He was truly a legal giant, but most of all, I'm proud to call him my friend.
I am now very pleased to introduce you to John Peedy, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Madam Speaker, Mr. Majority Leader, Congressman Lewis, members of Congress, judges, distinguished guests, it's an honor to address this august body in this historic courthouse that shaped not only our laws, but our way of life, and also gave wings to what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. I am a Mississippian, raised off of Highway 80, the son of an Alabama father and a Georgia mother. And I am a proud Southerner because of the courageous acts in this city and in this region by Congressman John Lewis, by Reverend James Lawson, by my late dear friend Will Campbell, Reverend Campbell, by Judge Frank Johnson, by the brave trailblazers such as Claudette Colvin, and Rosa Parks and many others. And I wish to speak with you about the importance of character, especially in those that we have entrusted to lead us. And I expect that you will see how essential the humanities are to developing character and a just, equitable, and free society. Let us start with the founders. We often look upon the founders of our nation as too great or too lowly for our times. Great in that they laid down their very lives to create a new nation, to bring constitutional democracy into the world. Lowly for being slaveholders, for declaring other children of God mere property and 3/5 of a white man under the law. The founders are more like us than we sometimes want to admit, which is to say, they were human and they were flawed. But they had something that I think is too often missing in our society, the ability to self-correct. Consider, for example, the petition in 1782 to Congress from the Continental Army for long overdue back pay and wages. The troops worried that when the war ended and their military service was no longer needed, they would go unpaid or underpaid. They worried that other creditors with better connections would be compensated instead. Henry Knox, General Washington's second-in-command, petitioned Congress thus, quote, "We are born all that men can bear. Our property is extended. Our private resources are at an end. Our friends are wearied out and disgusted in our incessant applications," unquote. Major General Alexander McDougall advocated for a national tax, seeking to bind, quote, "the influence of Congress with that of the Army and the public creditors to obtain permanent funds for the United States," unquote. Knox rejected McDougall, saying, quote, "I consider the reputation of the American Army as one of the most immaculate things on earth. We should even suffer wrongs and injury to the utmost verge of toleration rather than sully it in the least degree," unquote. Congress did pay the troops after independence was won, but that is not the point to me. It is those words of Knox that even in the midst of its birthing, we were already speaking of these United States as set apart from other nations in our ideals and our aspirations. We must claim this heritage. Next, let us turn to Frederick Douglass. And here I am drawing from the free K-12 lesson plans on the NEH website, Excitement, used by some 2.5 million people and educators each year. And I am drawing on the new NEH-supported Pulitzer Prize-winning Douglass biography by David Blight. On July 5th, 1852, before an audience of 600 in New York, Douglass delivered his searing address, "What to the American Slave is Your July 4th?" Following a reading of the Declaration of Independence, Douglass said that it was, quote, "a day that reveals to him, the enslaved, more than all other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour," unquote. And yet, I tell you, you will not find another speech that praises our nation and our founders with such moral force, such length. Fellow citizens, Douglass wrote in part, quote, "I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men," unquote. And he continues, "The Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Read its preamble, consider its purposes. Is slavery among them? Is it at the gateway, or is it in the temple? It is neither. While I do not intend to argue this question on the present occasion, let me ask if it be not somewhat singular that if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slaveholding document, slaveholding instrument, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can be found anywhere in it, unquote. In Douglas's literalist interpretation of the text, one hears echoes of Judge Johnson, who a century later would find separate but equal unconstitutional. If we were to properly mark the pivotal moments in our nation's moral development, then we must linger in this courthouse, on the bridge, beyond these walls, down the road. About Judge Johnson and his rulings in support of the integration of the Montgomery bus system, the Freedom Riders, the Selma March, one can do no better than quote Congressman Lewis in the Yale Law Journal. He writes about the judge. His career demonstrates the wisdom of those great Americans who drafted our Constitution. Our forefathers proved wise enough to provide the courts not only the moral authority based in our Constitution and Bill of Rights and embodied in people like Judge Johnson, but also the independence necessary to exert that authority at those times when the bedrocks of our freedom, the rights of all Americans to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is threatened, unquote. In this age of historical illiteracy, it is important to keep alive such legacies. I worry about whether our school children have sufficient access to comprehensive, nuanced cultural knowledge in their classrooms. We cannot ask our young adults, our youth, to defend representative democracy unless we ensure first that they have a foundational understanding of what the roots of our democracy are. I won't recount the Selma March when we are in the presence of the ones who did it. Instead, let me praise Congressman Lewis for his courage not merely on that day, but during his legislative career. We err sometimes when we put the living on pedestals because our youth look upon them sometimes and think, I could never be that strong, that fearless, that dedicated. I appreciate the Congressman's autobiographies, especially the National Book Award winner, March, Book 3, for telling the march complete with the uncertainty and the internal conflicts within the movement as the historic moment approached. Rather than unraveling in such times of dissent, our nation has proven its innate ability to self-correct. Like many of you, I believe in American exceptionalism, and I believe of it because of things that happened in this courtroom, and I believe that sometimes it must be purchased in blood on battlefields and tragically in the streets. Now, by request, I won't use the time left to me or this occasion to wax poetic about the National Endowment for the Humanities to a captive audience. I won't tell you for decades that NEH has funded the preservation, interpretation, publication of the papers of great Americans, from the founders to Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. Nor will I note our founding of the groundbreaking documentaries such as Stanley Nelson's History of HBCUs and his film on the Freedom Riders featuring Congressman Lewis, or the Civil Wars and Vietnam War films by Ken Burns, or the forthcoming PBS documentary on the suffrage movement and the 19th Amendment, or our funding of the new Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi, or lastly, our focus on language revitalization for Native Americans and other indigenous people of our land. I won't note, lastly, the 55 state and territorial humanities councils that reach an audience of 137 million people a year through projects such as the NEH-funded Stony the Road We Trod, the Teacher Institutes, which immerses educators from across the country in Alabama's civil rights history and equips these teachers with the materials and strategies for sharing this knowledge with their students. NEH is able to make these grants because the public understands that the humanities are nothing less than the anchor of engaged citizenship. As part of our agency's largest budget in a decade, Congress approved $4 million for a new grant category, a more perfect union. As our nation approaches its 250th anniversary in 2026, this initiative will help Americans better understand the world's oldest constitutional democracy and how our founding ideals are met in a modern, pluralistic society. NEH will fund projects to promote a deeper understanding of American history and culture that advance civics education and knowledge about the core principles of our government. And we will use the semi-quincentennial as an opportunity to share the histories of the people on this land before nationhood began. In a dark time, Abraham Lincoln called our nation the last best hope of earth. He was right then and now, and our fellow citizens have entrusted this sacred legacy to you, to us. May we find our best selves for their sake and our own. Yes, I worry about what has been lost, de-emphasized, or ignored in our communities and our culture, such as civility itself. And I worry about our capacity to bring it back. And yet I'm an optimist. With eyes wide open, with a sense of realism, with historical understanding, we must do everything we can to commit ourselves to optimism, not merely for ourselves, but for those who come next, so that they too can live meaningful, impactful, fulfilling lives. I am an optimist because of the rulings from this courthouse, because of a courageous woman on a Montgomery bus, because of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge by brave men and women. I am an optimist because of the mere existence of the Humanities Endowment, and because every grant maker is, at heart, an optimist. And because you are in this room on this day for this reason, I cannot help but think that you're an optimist too. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tiffany Moore. I have the pleasure of serving on the board of directors of the Faith and Politics Institute, and I will have a couple of my colleagues join me here. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about our friend Martha Roby. I have been affiliated with the Faith and Politics Institute. I think I went on my first pilgrimage in 1999. And it's all about shared common experience, and that's one of the reasons why we do this pilgrimage. And Brian Stevenson talked last night about the importance and the power of proximity, and that it's about everything that we do and being a part of faith and politics. When I first met Martha, I knew she was a passionate advocate for her district. She understood the importance and the significance of Montgomery, not just to the state and the nation's history, but for the country. And that was the Faith and Politics Institute, and her getting involved was an extension of that. And Margaret, we have watched you grow over each of these years at the pilgrimage. But it speaks to your mother's understanding of the importance of you learning your history and being proud of it, but also amplifying that, not just in the state or in the country, but worldwide. So you've met incredible people, and it's a service to your mother. One of the things about Faith and Politics Institute is that it's rooted in bipartisanship. And we're actually mourning the death of Congressman Amo Houghton, who was central, a Republican congressman from New York, who was central to the establishment of the organization and these pilgrimages. And when I look at the strong Republican support that we have gotten over the years, your name will be among them. If you think of Amo Houghton, Congressman Fred Upton, who actually is the reason why I came to these pilgrimages to begin with, Congressman Senator Tim Scott, you, Martha, will be a part of that strong Republican support that we've had. And I just want to thank you as a friend. I know this is going to be your last year as a part of the official delegation, but I know it's not the last time that you'll be a part of this trip. So thank you so much.
I can't let this day go by without just saying how much I have enjoyed our friendship over the years. Martha and I are forever involved and will be linked in this journey that we started in 2010 as Alabama's first elected women to Congress. But what the history books will not say, but I hope that they will, is that during a time of divisiveness and division, there was real service and real friendship among the two of us. What I hope the history books will also say is that because of the fierce advocacy of the two women in the Alabama delegation, we fought for catfish and fish farmers, we fought for peanut growers, we got millions of dollars, and we also helped the city, this river region, acquire the F-35 fifth generation fighter for our Air National Guard. I want to thank you for the fact that while we may not have the same ideology, political ideology, I know that we share a similar heart for service, and I never doubted once your commitment to the people that you serve and to the state of Alabama. Because of that, I just want you to know that I want our friendship to, I know it will survive Congress, but I also would love my colleagues to know how honored I am every day to walk the halls of Congress with you. Not because of your commitment to your constituency, but because of your heart for service and your heart for people. I've gotten a chance to share Margaret and George with you, and Riley has been my second husband. Thank you, Riley. And your lovely mom and dad. I will miss our quarterly dinners. Martha and I would go to dinner. Way too, not often enough, but we all had a rule that we only talked politics for 5 minutes each. And the rest was about our families and, of course, drinking lots of Pinot Noir wine. But I just want to say that my staff loves you, we all love you, and Alabama is a better place because of this. So on the 55th anniversary of the Selma and Montgomery March and the 100th celebration of women's suffrage, I think it's befitting that I give my dear friend,
I wasn't prepared. I joked earlier when they put us up here, did I have to say anything? So I really am not prepared, but Terri, thank you, and Tiffany, and Faith and Politics, Joan. It's been amazing to work with you. Congressman Lewis, as my father said, thank you so much for being my friend. It's been a joy to serve with you. It's been wonderful. I was looking back through my photos of all the times you so graciously took pictures with my children, and really I have one of George in diapers when he was that young, being with you on these trips. Again, not really prepared, but it's an honor to be with you, judges, Dad, Mom, and all of these distinguished guests this morning. I will just tell you that it has been my tremendous honor and privilege to serve the people of Alabama's 2nd District for almost 10 years. And as my time in Congress is coming to an end, it's moments like these. I was actually sitting there and I was looking at you sitting next to Margaret, and I thought to myself, take a snapshot in your head. Remember this moment. To be here with all of you, I'm looking around the room, I'm seeing so many faces of friends that have helped guide me and steer me throughout my time in Congress. This has truly been my privilege and joy, and to be here in this room today with all of you, to remember, to reflect, to be inspired. You have done that all over again for me here today, and so I will go back to Congress with that much more energy in these last 10 months. But I will always hold this decade in my heart as being one of the most amazing things that my family, Margaret and George and Riley, that we've been able to serve our country in this way. So just thank you. Thank you for this honor, and thank you for your friendship. This is amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is good. It is good. Martha, thank you for your service. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for never giving up, but for keeping the faith and keeping your eyes on the prize. You know, over the past few years, we've been on many flights together, coming from D.C. to Atlanta. I tell you, I hate to see you go. We're going to miss you. It's good to be in Montgomery one more time. It's good to be in Alabama one more time. My first visit to this courthouse was May 1961 in Jerry Johnson Court. Just a witness. Then I came back here again. During the march from Selma to Montgomery, I was in this court again. He was an unbelievable man. And Judge, you may remember one day I came here and you said to me, Congressman, Judge Johnson is upstairs. He would love to see you. And I went up, was doing some research on a book that I was working on. And Judge Johnson said, let me have someone to go into the files. And he gave me a copy of some notes that he had taken when I testified. He was an unbelievable man, a wonderful human being. And I remember during the march from Selma to Montgomery, when he pulled up his robe, shook his robe, and came back and gave us everything that we had asked for. Man of conscience. He helped change the state, helped change our nation, and we are a better people because of George Frank M. Johnson. So I said to members of the bench, thank you. Thank you for your service. And thank all of the wonderful and great citizens of this state. Good to see you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for never giving up, for never giving in, but for keeping the faith and keeping your eyes on the prize. Thank all of my colleagues from Washington for being here. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program at the courthouse.